Welcome to Army MWR Libraries Presents. Today we are hosting Tom Young. I'm Michael Steinmacher, director of the Barr Memorial Library. Our guest Tom served in Afghanistan and Iraq with the Air National Guard. He also flew combat missions to Bosnia and Kosovo. He retired with more than 20 years of service, and his decorations include the Meritorious Service Medal, 3 Air Medals, 3 Aerial Achievement Medals, and the Air Force Combat Action Medal. He's worked as a writer and an editor with the Associated Press, and he currently works as an airline pilot based at Reagan National Airport near Washington, D.C. Tom is the author of military adventure novels, which include Silver Wings, Iron Cross, and The Mullah Storm. Today, we're going to be talking to him about his new book, Red Burning Sky, which is a historical spy thriller based on the real-life story of Operation Halyard, which was the largest rescue mission of American airmen in history. If you're interested in asking a question, I would encourage you to put that in the chat. Tom and I are going to be having essentially a discussion, and I will be sharing his questions with him as we go. But definitely, if you've got questions, thoughts, comments, please put them in the chat, and I will be sharing them with Tom. So first of all, Tom, welcome. Thanks for taking time out of your day today.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to speak with you, Michael. This is quite an honor. It's good to get a chance to chat with you folks.
Well, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about the background on Operation Halyard?
Yes, Operation Halyard is something I often refer to as the greatest military rescue you've never heard of. Even though it was one of the largest aviation rescues in history, I find that even a lot of World War II buffs haven't heard of it. And so if you're tuning into this and you haven't heard of it before now, don't feel bad. There's some reasons why this thing was kept under wraps, not only at the time, but even after the war. It was something that was very politically and diplomatically sensitive. But perhaps the first question that comes to your mind is, wait a minute, Operation Halyard was a rescue of more than 500 downed American flyers in Yugoslavia in 1944. What were 500 American flyers doing on the ground in Yugoslavia to begin with? And the answer to that question has everything to do with the target they were trying to hit. These were mainly bomber crews, mainly crews of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. And they had been sent to hit the German-run oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania. World War II was the first truly mechanized war. And for that reason, the Allied command decided one of the best ways to stop Hitler's mechanized army would be to starve it of fuel. So for that reason, the refineries at Ploiești became a high priority target. But they also became a heavily defended target. The Germans defended those refineries ferociously with anti-aircraft artillery and smoke screens over the target and fighter aircraft around the target. And over time, as the U.S. and the Allies sent mission after mission to hit these refineries, a lot of aircraft went down. The egress and ingress routes to and from the target took the aircraft over Yugoslavia. So that's where a lot of these airmen bailed out of their stricken aircraft. When they did so, they found themselves parachuting into a very complicated situation on the ground. They were literally dropping into a civil war in the middle of a world war. At the time in Yugoslavia, you had 2 main guerrilla factions. You had the non-communist Chetniks, led by General Draza Mihailovic, and then you had the communist-leaning partisans, led by Joseph Broz Tito. And when these 2 groups were not fighting Nazis, they were fighting each other. So that's the very complicated situation that these airmen were parachuting into. And both of these sides helped shelter downed American airmen. But it was mainly the Chetnik side that was most operational in making Operation Halyard a success. And that story was the inspiration for my novel, Red Burning Sky.
So I'm curious, you described a lot of really intriguing, interesting moving parts here that are clearly history as we know it and have recorded it. So why did you choose to tell your story as historical fiction versus more of a straight historical account?
Well, with fiction, you can take certain liberties that you can't take with nonfiction. With nonfiction, you've got to make every effort to get everything exactly factually correct. But with fiction, you can take liberties. You can start with a broad, accurate historical background, and I like to think that I did that. But I had three main point of view characters that were entirely made up, and that way I could get into their heads, imagine what they were thinking, make up what they may have been thinking. It's not fair to do that with a real life person, because no matter how hard you try, you really can't get into that person's head. So for a lot of reasons, I felt most comfortable working in fiction with this particular story.
Could you tell us a little bit about those three main characters that you mentioned?
Yes, the story is told from the point of view of three main fictional characters. One of them is one of the downed airmen. He is a B-24 bombardier named Bill Bogdanovich. Bogdanovich comes from a Serbian-American family. His father immigrated from Yugoslavia, from Serbia, well before World War II. In fact, the younger Bogdanovich was actually born in the U.S. He considers himself entirely an American, entirely a man of the modern world. And the father's nostalgia for the old country and the son's disdain for the old ways have always been a source of friction between them. But now, all of a sudden, the younger Bogdanovich has a B-24 blown out from under him, and he finds himself dependent on people just like his father for his very survival. And he learns to appreciate why they are the way they are and why they do things the way they do. And that's that particular character's story arc. Another of my point of view characters is one of the pilots of the C-47s that came in to land on hand-built dirt airstrips and rescue these downed airmen. And I should emphasize again, this is an entirely made-up character. His name is Drew Carlton. And Drew has a checkered military past. He began his military career as a bomber pilot based in England. And on three occasions, rather than hitting his target on a mission, he turned back for mechanical reasons. And in all three of those cases, he really did have a mechanical issue, but maybe it was a gray area about whether it was really necessary to turn back. So he feels that earned him the reputation of a coward. In fact, his bosses decided he could best serve the war effort by going back home and serving as an instructor, because he was considered a highly skilled pilot, but not necessarily an adequately aggressive pilot. So this fictional character feels he carries that stain, and he sees volunteering for this very dangerous Operation Halyard as a way to find his courage, a way to redeem himself and get back in the fight. So that's that character's arc. My third point of view character is a teenage Serbian guerrilla named Vaza, a 17-year-old Serbian guerrilla who gets involved with helping protect these downed airmen and helping in their recovery. And believe it or not, that character was based on someone I knew. But when I was a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I took a wonderful course in Russian novels. And it was taught by a gentleman named Dr. Vaza Mihalovich. No relation to General Mihalovich. That's a common Serbian family name. And when I knew him, he was a respected scholar of Russian and East European literature. But in his teenage years, he had picked up a weapon and fought with a guerrilla unit, fought alongside a guerrilla unit, fighting against Nazis and communists at the same time. He fought in this civil war in the middle of a world war. And he really had quite an inspiring personal story. The combat and the experiences that my character, Vaza, go through are not necessarily based on my old professor's actual experiences. He did not talk with us much about his combat experiences, but the things that you see my character Vaza go through are my imagining of what someone in that situation might have experienced.
So we had a question that you inadvertently just answered partially. The question was, were your characters based on influenced by real life?
Definitely. They were definitely, especially the character of Vaza. The real life Dr. Vaza Mihalovich was quite an inspiration. He was a beloved professor at UNC. And as I alluded to a moment ago, his personal story was quite fascinating. When the communists took over Yugoslavia, understandably, he found it prudent to leave Yugoslavia. He spent 5 years in refugee camps in Germany and in Italy. And in 1951, he made his way to the U.S. And he said that when he arrived in New York Harbor, he was given an envelope with $50 and a bus ticket to Kansas City. He takes the job. He takes the bus to Kansas City, gets a job there that he does not like. So he takes another bus to Detroit, gets a job on a Chrysler assembly line. This is just the classic American immigrant story. While working that assembly line, he paid his way through college and he got his undergraduate degree, his master's, and his PhD in Eastern European literature, and became a very respected scholar in that field. And in his later years, he wrote poetry and short stories. He marched for civil rights, and he became an avid fan of Tar Heel basketball. So, when I tell a story, I just think, can you imagine that life journey from fighting for your life in the hills of Serbia to cheering for the Tar Heels in Carmichael Auditorium? But that's who inspired my character, Vasa.
Can you tell us about the working with the fine balance between fact and fiction?
Yes, and a fine balance is a good way to put it. Although you can take liberties, as I mentioned before, you still have to strive to get things right, especially technical details. For example, in a World War II story, if you're writing a World War II novel, there's always going to be someone who knows more about the M1 Garand rifle than you do. And if you make an error, they will see it. There's always going to be someone who knows more about the B-17 Flying Fortress than you do. So you strive to get the details as accurate as you can. Of course, from time to time, writers do make mistakes in those sorts of things, and that's just something we live with. But you work hard to keep that stuff as accurate as possible. The subject reminds me of something that Ernest Hemingway supposedly once said: "When you know a subject well enough, you know what you can leave out." So yes, you want to get technical details right, but you want to put those in with a light brush. I mean, you don't want to do a data dump on how pilots did every checklist in the B-17, but put in just enough to give some authenticity. You also have to get the broad historical background right. Although my characters in Red Burning Sky are made up, the overall mission is not, the overall scenario is not. You can take some historical liberties. My philosophy on that is, if you do take historical liberties, you need to fess up to them in the historical notes at the end of the book. Give you an example. In one of my other historical novels, I had a minor incident take place that impacts the action, and in my novel, that incident took place in. I had it happening in November of '44. In reality, it happened in June of '44, and it was just a minor thing. But in the historical notes, I fessed up to taking that particular liberty. You can get away with a lot, but at least in the historical notes, I think you need to be open about what you tried to get away with.
It's interesting because I'm thinking about, when we think about history and we think about recording narratives and so on and so forth, we talk a lot about bias. these days and what bias a person might be coming from. And, you know, your career in the International Guard, you spent a considerable amount of time serving as flight engineer, as I recall.
Correct.
And I was wondering if your own past history and your work experience in your service made that more, did you find yourself more drawn to the air elements of this story, or was the aerial part of it particularly attractive in that regard?
Definitely. Operation Halyard was essentially an airlift mission. They flew C-47s, which is a military version of the DC-3, into these hand-built dirt airstrips to pick up these guys. And this happened over a period of months, from the summer of 44 into January of 45. And I'm an old airlifter myself. I was an engineer on C-130s and C-5s. So it's the kind of mission that people in my military community would have flown in World War II, you know, had we been in that era rather than our own. So as an airlifter, the technical aspects of the mission fascinated me. And what fascinated me the most was what they were able to achieve with C-47s and World War II technology. In some cases, they were landing on these short dirt airstrips at night, with the airstrips lit by nothing but burning hay bales. And what they did in Operation Halyard, rescuing, you know, more than 500 downed airmen, usually taking out about a dozen at a time on any given airplane, because the runways were so short they couldn't take off at max gross weight, so they had to limit how many people they could put on. What they did in that day would be challenging even now with C-130s and night vision goggles. And I've discussed this with some of my old squadron mates, and they say, you know, the reason those guys did it back then is they didn't know they couldn't do it. They didn't get the memo that it was supposed to be impossible, so they just went and did it. But again, I just have so much respect for the crews that pull that off, because it wouldn't be easy at all, even now.
And what's interesting about it is you've made reference to it, and I'm hoping you'll comment a little bit more on it. They didn't just do this once. They did this repeatedly until they got almost 500 men out. So the fact that they not only did it, but accomplished it repeatedly under those circumstances, that is even more fascinating to me.
Exactly. They did it repeatedly, and they had very, very little room for error. They didn't have any serious accidents, and they couldn't afford to have any. If, say, for example, a C-47 pilot had rolled his airplane into a ball on one of those dirt airstrips, that would have been worse than disastrous, because not only would it have blocked use of that airfield indefinitely, but the post-crash smoke and fire almost certainly would have alerted the Germans. So they just couldn't afford any serious mistakes. And over a period of months, they kept doing this without any serious mistakes. It's just an outstanding achievement. And it's a shame it's not better known, but it was kept under wraps for a long time for a couple of reasons. Of course, originally the main reason for keeping it under wraps was operational security. They didn't know how long they were going to have to keep doing this. But even after they knew they were finished, it was sort of kept on the QT because of diplomatic sensitivities. Of course, at the time, the Soviets were our allies in trying to defeat the Germans, and defeating the Nazis was the top priority. So perhaps there was some concern about ruffling feathers in Moscow if we made a big deal about working very closely with the non-communist guerrillas who were fighting the communist guerrillas. So there was that. I think there was also some concern about not wanting to ruffle feathers in London, because the British were our primary allies in World War II. And there were elements in the British government who favored working with the partisans as opposed to working with the Chetniks, not because of any sympathy with communism necessarily, but just because they felt the partisans were more effective in fighting the Nazis. So there was that sensitivity too. So that's why this thing wasn't publicized the way you would think it would be. I mean, with a rescue this brilliant, you would think eventually it would get splashed all over Life magazine, and it would be all over the newsreels and the movie theaters, but it never was. and these diplomatic sensitivities are why.
Just a reminder, if you have questions for Mr. Young, please put them in the chat. I'm integrating them into our conversation as we go. You know, Tom, I was thinking about your work in terms of working for the Associated Press and the research that's involved in journalism. Can you talk a little bit about how that research might have differed from the research that you do for a work like this or one of your works of fiction?
Well, when you're researching a book, you have much more time. By journalistic standards, you have all the time in the world. I worked for the broadcast division of the Associated Press, so we had news watches that would move on the hour, or rather, that would move on the wire multiple times per hour. We had newscasts for the AP radio network at the top of every hour. So I was used to deadlines not coming at the end of the year, but deadline coming at the end of the hour. So it was a great deal of time pressure. And of course, with that kind of time pressure, that limits how thoroughly you can research something. Now, that's not to say that the AP doesn't do thorough research. For the print division, you can have a reporter working on a special story or a series for months. But in terms of covering the day-to-day breaking news, you just don't have time to do that kind of research. And when I moved from daily journalism to fiction writing, even if it's fiction writing inspired by real events, I just felt I had this grand luxury of time to look into things more deeply than I'd ever had time to do so before.
So when you were a journalist, did you ever imagine you'd be writing novels? And the question from one of our listeners is, can you imagine you would actually be making a living at it? So talk to us about making a leap as a writer.
Even when I was working as a journalist, I had a dream of writing fiction as well. I've always been interested in any kind of writing. I was interested enough in journalism to spend 10 years with the AP, but I had studied fiction writing, from the time I was old enough to write seriously. Anyway, for example, when I went to University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I studied mass communication and journalism. But even then, I also went through the English department's creative writing program. And along the way, while I was working in journalism, I continued to dabble in fiction. I wrote the occasional short story that got published in literary magazines that nobody reads. But I never had a good idea for a novel that I could really sink my teeth into until 9/11 came along and my Air National Guard unit got activated and deployed, and we began flying in and out of Afghanistan. And then later we began flying in and out of Iraq, and that gave me plenty of material to work with. And that's what inspired my first several novels, which were set in the present day. And then eventually I turned to historical fiction.
So another question we have is, when you had talked about the characters and are the places that you recount, whereas the characters are fictionalized, are the places accurate and named historically correctly?
They are. I have been in Yugoslavia, but not on a specific research trip. I flew in and out of the former Yugoslavia on airlift missions during the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo. So I've seen some of that terrain, but honestly, I've never seen any of it for long at a time. But all of the place names that I refer to in Red Burning Sky are real, and one of my main sources for researching Operation Halyard was a book by a gentleman named Gregory Freeman, and it's called The Forgotten 500. And I read that book very closely, and it gave me the essential facts of Operation Halyard. Which reminds me of another point I'd like to make. Very often, when you fictionalize a historical event, you make it larger than life in a lot of ways. But with Red Burning Sky, if anything, I did the opposite. What I mean by that is uh, with Red Burning Sky, I sort of limited the number of characters. I limited the time frame that the action takes place in. And I did all that to create a tighter narrative and a tighter story. But the real Operation Halyard was even bigger than what I described in Red Burning Sky. Or to put it another way, if you read Red Burning Sky and you think that military operation is extraordinary, what really happened is even more extraordinary. For example, I described the construction of a dirt airstrip. Well, as we learn more about Operation Halyard, and as wonderful groups like the Halyard Mission Foundation continue to research Operation Halyard, they've learned that there were at least 3 airstrips that were built. As they do more historical research, it's kind of like peeling the layers of an onion. The more you learn, the more you realize there's yet more to learn. The action in Red Burning Sky takes place in 6 or 8 weeks in the summer of 1944. The real-life Operation Halyard went more like from June of 44 to January of 45. So it was an even bigger deal than what I described in the novel.
So it's interesting, I've been thinking about this, and it's kind of been a thread in my mind throughout this whole conversation. If this was such a significant event that we still don't know about, how did you come across this and decide to write about it?
I was interested in some of the special operations of World War II, operations that involved the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was a forerunner of the CIA. And when you start Googling OSS in World War II and researching things that the OSS did, Operation Halyard looms large. It's one of their bigger, more successful operations. And that's what led me down this rabbit hole.
And once you started down the rabbit hole, you couldn't extricate yourself?
Exactly. I mean, when I found out it was a major airlift mission, well, that was right up my alley as an old airlifter. And it was in a part of the world where I had been, with C-130 missions during the 90s as the former Yugoslavia was tearing itself apart. And and I was fascinated with that part of the world, given this experience I'd had with a professor from there who, we all thought so highly of. So there was just a lot of threads that kind of pulled me in that direction.
Would you visit the places that you've talked about historically or current day that you haven't? And is there some place that you've talked about in the books or in Operation Halyard you'd like to go that you haven't been?
Oh yes, I would love to go back to the former Yugoslavia and see that terrain in better times. It's high on my bucket list to visit Normandy. There are a lot of World War II sites I would like to visit. I've visited some of them, but there are a lot of important World War II sites in Europe that I have not visited. And of course, many sites in the Pacific as well that I would like to visit. Of course, they're much farther flung and harder to reach, but yes, there's no end to the historic sites I would like to visit, time permitting.
So, you mentioned, you worked on your fiction. Now you've done this historical fiction. What are you working on now?
I'm working on another World War II novel now, and it is set within the French Resistance. And that's a subject that, honestly, I didn't know a great deal about. So I'm having to do some research in that corner of the war, and that's a fascinating subject too. So many people did such courageous things in the effort to put up resistance against the Germans in occupied France. And another thing that interests me there is the British Air Forces, the British RAF's efforts to support the French resistance. They made some very, very daring flights into occupied France, usually at night, in small single-engine aircraft, and they would deliver supplies and weapons and so forth to resistance agents. In some cases, they would pick up resistance agents, resistance officers, fly them to Britain for consultations, fly them back, land in the middle of a farmer's pasture in the middle of the night. Just some very daring things to support the resistance.
But I have a question about female characters. Do you have any of them as primary agents in this work you're working on now?
Yes, I do. In the novel that I'm working on now, one of my two main characters is a French-American woman who has volunteered to serve with the resistance.
So how long did it take you to write Red Burning Sky?
2 years. It took me 2 years to write that, and that's pretty typical for me. If I'm on a deadline and well, especially if the book is part of a series, which my first 6 novels were, I can light a fire under myself and finish a novel in a year. But if it's a standalone novel, and my historical novels have all been, even though they've all been set in World War II, they're not a series. They've been set in different parts of the war. They generally take me 2 years, so it'll probably be 2 years with this one as well.
So I'm curious, talking about your current project and in reference, of course, to Red Burning Sky. You know, librarians love to know and love to participate in research. Talk to me a little bit about what you're doing to dig into this story, especially since you mentioned you don't know a whole lot about the subject matter that you're working with now.
Well, of course, I'm reading a lot of nonfiction books about the French resistance, and also, believe it or not, I'm finding a lot of helpful things on YouTube. I mean, of course, online there's a lot of garbage, but there's a lot of useful stuff too. And someone, perhaps a lot of someones, has done us writers and historians a great favor by uploading to YouTube all kinds of World War II training films. So that becomes a great resource for technical research. You can find a contemporary training film for almost anything you can imagine from World War II. If you want to know how they were taught to disassemble and clean and load and fire an M1 rifle, you can find that. If you want to know how they packed parachutes in that day, you can find that. If you want a video on how they operated those great big backpack field radios, you can find that. And one of the things that surprised me about that is the quality of those training films. But back then, the War Department enlisted a lot of Hollywood talent to produce, direct, and appear in those training films. And those films are as good as any training film I ever had in the military. The only difference is they're in black and white, and my training films were color. You set aside the color difference, maybe those training films were even better just because of the A-listers who took part in the production of those films. So all that stuff is on YouTube, and it's very, very helpful.
So you talked a little bit about some of where the origins of the story came from and how your characters were inspired, but where do you draw inspiration from? Are there authors, anybody in particular that serves as a muse, so to speak?
Oh, a good question. And I've had a number of positive influences in my life that have drawn me to World War II. And then there's a number of World War II authors that I admire as well. So just to begin with the personal mentors, my grandfather was a World War II veteran. He was a mechanic on B-17 Flying Fortresses. And I grew up hearing his stories from World War II. And that fired in me an interest in that part of history, and also an interest in aviation and in flying. And it has a lot to do with why I became a flyer. It has a lot to do with why I became someone who writes about World War II. Later in my life, I had a coworker who was a World War II veteran. Back in the 80s, before I worked for the AP, I was a reporter and anchor at WDNC Radio in Durham, North Carolina. And at that time, that radio station was owned by the Herald Sun Corporation, the company that published the Durham Morning Herald and the Durham Evening Sun newspapers. And there was a columnist for the Herald, a wonderful gentleman named Ed Hodges. and of course he was much older than me, and he was a World War II veteran, but we hit it off immediately. And I came to find out he had been a C-47 pilot in World War II. And his stories also got me interested in flying and in that history, and that has a lot. That also has something to do with why I wrote Red Burning Sky, and for that matter, why I became a flyer. Ed was a modest guy, though. All he told me was that he had flown C-47s in World War II in the China-Burma-India theater, flying over the hump, flying over the Himalayas. That's all he told me. Sadly, when he passed away, I read his obituary, and only then did I learn he had earned the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was really accomplished and such a gentleman. So he was one of my influences. As far as writers are concerned, I've always been a big fan of the authors who were World War II veterans who wrote some of the great World War II novels that came out in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. People like James Jones, the author of The Caine Mutiny, and War and Remembrance and the Winds of War. I'm drawing a blank on that name, but I'll think of it in a minute. But people like James Michener, James Jones, these wonderful World War II novels that are about that thick. I've always loved those.
You're thinking of Herman Wouk.
Exactly, Herman Wouk. Exactly.
So, well, I really appreciate you taking time to talk to us about your Red Burning Sky today.
Well, thank you. This has been a pleasure. I'm honored by your interest in the novel, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone.
So, we've been talking with Tom Young about his historical fiction, Red Burning Sky, which is based on the real-life rescue Operation Halyard, which brought out almost 500 servicemen during World War II. So again, Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I certainly appreciate it. I've enjoyed chatting with you all.
Thank you.